community at the UVA Career Center. I'm actually going to have my colleague George introduce himself really quickly before we go ahead and get started. Go ahead, George.
Sure. Hey, everybody. George Pikuda. I'm the Associate Director for the Science and Sustainability Career Committee. I'm the person that you're probably getting all those emails from in the newsletters. So that's me.
Awesome. So we're partnering on this event since this area sort of spans both the business side of things and the sustainability environmental side of things. So thank you all so much for being here, for being curious, for hearing from our alum, Sydney. So this typically how it works is we'll have about 40 minutes of me asking Sydney some questions that we pre-prepared. There'll be time for you all to ask questions too. So throughout the session, you have things you're curious about. Feel free to pop them in the chat. You can get the question. We'll make sure we get to it at the end to ask that question. Just logistics, viewing experience. If you hit speaker view in the top right corner, it makes it look a little bit less chaotic with all the different bubbles that you'll be seeing on the screen. You all have been muted upon entry. If you want to ask your question verbally, please feel comfortable to do that when the time comes for questions at the end. That is completely okay. On our end, video can be on or off, totally your call, whatever you're most comfortable with. So I guess we'll go ahead and just get started with the session today. So Sydney, thanks for being here. To get us kicked off, tell us a little bit about your major when you were at UVA and kind of about your first roles when you left the university.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited. I graduated in 2017. I had a double major in environmental science and environmental thought and practice. I'm currently working managing software development for the Air Force. So I'm still with the same company that I am when I first left UVA. It was my first job. But I'm in a slightly different role now. The role that I started out in was more consulting on environmental management systems, or EMS. EMS is an international standard for it, and we help the Air Force implement an effective environmental management system. And a lot of that is around building and developing software tools to track their data. An example is like, we built a tool so that every Air Force base can record when like EPA comes out and inspects the base to make sure they're compliant with environmental laws. And then if they get an enforcement action or a notice of non-compliance from EPA, they can enter it into the system and track it all. And so that headquarters Air Force has a view into everything going on at the installations. So that's an example of like a tool that we would build, but then we also did a lot of, or we still do, not so much me anymore, but just giving recommendations and guidance of how the Air Force can become more efficient managing their environmental system. So since then, though, I've kind of transitioned into a more project management role in a group that does not really relate to the environment. It's still part of the Air Force. It's just a different group. It's not the environmental directorate, but same concept of management systems, building software tools to help them track data and everything. I found this job because a professor had sent out an email that an old student was recruiting for her company, saw it, looked interesting. I applied, ended up getting it. I kind of lucked out. I have a really small company, but we've got a strong UVA presence in the office. There's like 16 of us in the office and 4 of us went to UVA, just because they've had a lot of good success recruiting people from UVA. They know the high quality of students that we are. So yeah, heard about it from an alum who was recruiting through one of my professors.
That's awesome. I love that UVA connection always ties true. So Sydney, on the call, as you know, we sort of have students of all different majors and sort of backgrounds and interests, but they centralize around interest in sustainability consulting, environmental consulting. Just for sort of layman terms, I think you sort of already got a little bit at this in the beginning. How would you define how it is, and maybe also how it maybe compares to traditional management consulting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So consulting in general, I would just define it as when a company or an organization wants advice on how to do something better for their company, but they don't want to do it in-house, so they just hire an outside person to come in and give them recommendations. And then from an environmental standpoint or sustainability standpoint, that's growing a lot. So there's a lot of companies who are looking to hire people to come in, tell them how to be more sustainable, environmentally friendly. It's actually very similar, I would say, to other management consulting, in the sense of you come in, you talk to a bunch of people at the company or the organization, see where there's room for improvement, present an idea or recommendation, and then help them implement that recommendation usually. So it's kind of the same process and concept that a lot of business consulting. I mean, I don't have experience in business specific consulting, but from what I've heard and talked to people about, it's that same approach of just coming in, identifying room for improvement in the organization, and implementing it.
Awesome. Super helpful. When you mentioned that alumni connection and professor email is what sort of sparked your applying to that role, could you speak at all to the recruitment process and how it worked for you? I guess students are super curious about how maybe a smaller organization may differ from a larger consulting firm like a Bain or a Deloitte or et cetera. Just curious about how that might work.
Yeah, so, the huge consulting companies like the Big Four, Bain, Deloitte, they typically, like every year, they'll say, okay, every year we're going to accept 150 new people. So they have like positions that they fill every single year. They've got a very defined process of how to recruit. They've got a whole team as part of the company that is solely just for recruiting. For a small company, it's a lot different. My company is 34 people now. I was the 24th employee. We don't have a recruiting department. It's just people on the team who are like, hey, we need someone else to help with this project. Like, let's try to find someone. And we don't hire just to hire. We hire when we need help. And probably like how we recruit is a little similar. Like we use, I think we've started using Indeed or one of the big job recruiting sources. But we do still, if we're looking for someone, we'll reach out to like our alumni connections. We'll email professors, whether that's at our universities or any universities that we have some connection to. That's kind of the difference.
Awesome. And that elusive case interview, do you all do that within your firms, or does it look different than the larger firms?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome.
I didn't talk so much. I forgot to talk about how that looked for me.
Totally fine.
The way my recruiting went, submitted an application, and then we did a phone call interview where they just kind of asked me about myself, gave me a couple what would you do in this situation? And then after that, they flew me down to come meet in person in the office. And my company, since we're a small company, that interview process looks a little bit different, I think, than it would at a big company, because in my interview, I met everyone in the office. So there's different sessions. One session was with the other environmental consultants in my company, so that they could ask me more environmental specific questions. And then they brought in the developers who, do a job that I don't do, but so that I could get a feel for the company culture, which I really appreciated. The culture and atmosphere of the office is actually what drew me to my company. I loved just the small feeling, and I got the sense that they truly cared about their employees and making sure that they each grew professionally and personally in the positions, which I didn't think I was going to get that at a large corporation.
Totally. Awesome. Thank you for that. That's super helpful. So you talked about the field a little bit in the beginning. I guess out of curiosity's perspective, what do you find most exciting about working in the environmental sustainability space?
It's growing. It is blooming. Everyday companies are realizing that customers are demanding that their companies are held accountable for environmental sustainability or sustainability in general. So there's a lot of opportunities. It's a kind of new field. So, you can look around, maybe even carve out your own path that doesn't exist. But there's a lot of new, exciting opportunities, and a lot of companies. So, they might hire an external out-of-house consultant to come in, but a lot of companies might also be looking to build their own in-house sustainability team. So that's also a possibility in this field. An example is Coca-Cola. Like, they're based here. I'm in Atlanta. Their headquarters is here. Coca-Cola has a huge sustainability initiative that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you think of Coca-Cola, but it's something to keep in mind when you're job searching, is just look for giant corporations that might be large enough to have their own sustainability section within the company.
Okay, awesome. I think we sometimes will hear saying that there are certain backgrounds that maybe lend themselves better to a career path in consulting. Could you speak maybe to how your liberal arts background led to sort of success within the consulting space?
Yeah, for sure. For consulting, like, you're going to end up consulting on things that you have no idea about, that you don't have experience in. And so the liberal arts background of having a little bit of experience in a lot of topics has really come in handy. Also, just the ability to do research on topics is vital, because if a topic comes up that I'm not familiar with, like, I've got the skills from the wide variety of classes that I've taken to figure out what it is I need to know about that topic. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, totally. And I know sometimes students are like, hey, I don't really have a business degree, so maybe I need to go to grad school and get an MBA to be competitive in consulting. And what is your take on that? Do students need an MBA to be successful in consulting?
It depends. I don't have an MBA. In my job, I have no interest. I have no interest in getting an MBA. If you're looking into sustainability consulting, I don't think an MBA is really needed. Yeah, it'll make you a little more competitive, but it's not required. And if you can just get your foot in the door, you can often work your way up without having to get higher degrees. So say before you go spend all the time and money getting an MBA, just try to get your foot in the door. Or if you're really looking at environmental consulting, look into something else that's more environmental focused. One thing that has really come in handy, which kind of goes back to your last question, is having a background in data and statistics. I use that all the time. Didn't really think about it. I was forced to take a statistics class for my ETP major, and I'm so glad that I did. So again, another benefit of having a liberal arts background, that and like Excel. But yeah, if you wanted to go into like strictly business consulting, I could see an MBA definitely being useful. It all kind of depends on where you're looking at.
Go ahead, George.
So back to that previous question, Sydney said research was a really big skill. The Excel, like the data part, was like a larger big skill, like a hard skill. Any other skills that you think could be helpful for students to maybe start cultivating now when they start considering environmental sustainability?
Yeah, you bring up a good point of hard skills versus soft skills. An important soft skill would be just people skills, being able to converse, being personable, because with consulting, you are meeting with people that, are not in your company. So you've got to put on a professional face, be friendly, be willing to talk about their kids and whatever. Because that's what if you form a relationship with people, then they're going to be more likely to listen to you, to give you the information that you need, and to take your recommendations when you present them. So that's important. I'm trying to think of some other like hard skills. Writing and grammar. It's amazing what I read, which has awful grammar. I would definitely recommend trying to clean that up. I'm trying to think of some other hard skills. Yeah, I'll think as we talk if I come up with anything else.
And there's another question about skills later, so if it comes back to you, we'll get to it. So you mentioned sort of getting your foot in the door and finding opportunities. You mentioned your company maybe posts on Indeed. I guess many of these students are thinking, okay, how do I find entry-level opportunities specifically in environmental consulting or sustainability consulting? Do you have any advice on how students may find opportunities in this space?
Yeah, well, one, use the UVA Alumni Network. We've got a close alumni network. I would be thrilled if anyone from UVA reached out to me asking about job advice. So look on that, just reach out. Even if their company's not hiring, they might know of someone else that they could point you to, especially like within your major. You've got I've got a special tie to my major departments. So that's nice. Keep a lookout for emails from professors. I got a ton of those. Also, if there's a company that you love, just find someone to reach out to. And even if they don't have a position open, just send them an email and say, hey, I have a background in this, really interested in doing this. Do you have any positions open? Or maybe not even asking if they have a position, but just saying is there someone I could talk to? I'd love to learn more about your company and what you're doing. Just trying to make a connection there. LinkedIn is a really good resource. I personally don't keep my LinkedIn that up to date, but I know a lot of friends who have found it. They've had recruiters reach out to them on LinkedIn. You can find people on it. There's all the big job websites, Monster, Indeed, etc. I also did a ton of informational interviews with people. Anyone who I could get to listen to me for 30 minutes, I would set up a meeting and just ask them questions what degree do you have? What are you doing? Do you like it? What do I need if I wanted to do that? Those were really, really helpful, just to get an understanding of what types of jobs are out there. And oftentimes it ended up with them being hey, apply, send a resume. So yeah, showing that initiative and being organized in those interviews is big.
I heard networking mentioned from you, which is something that we talk about all the time with students. And I heard use the UVA network. I think an example of students is that Sydney volunteered time to be here tonight to talk to you. So that's just one example of them giving their time, and she's giving us an hour and you're only asking for 15 or 30 minutes to learn more about their roles. So hugely helpful and hugely informative as you're sort of navigating that space. Sydney, if a student from this call wanted to connect with you, what would be the easiest way after the call to do that?
Oh, that's a great question. Do they have my email? I don't know what information you gave them.
They have your LinkedIn profile. I don't share email without permission, so.
Okay, I will make a better effort to check my LinkedIn if anyone wants to reach out to me there.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that works.
Awesome, perfect. So students, I'll make sure that's linked again in the follow-up message, because she said she'd be happy to hear from people. So if you're curious to talk to her more about your own path, here's a great example of a great alum to talk to. So awesome.
And what I'll say too about my company is, we're not actively looking to hire right now, but we are always looking for good talent. So if you are about to graduate and you want to send me your resume, do that. Even if we don't hire you now, we hold on to those resumes. So if a year or two down the road, we're looking for someone, we look back to the resumes that we've saved. And I think a lot of companies do that. So don't be afraid to just send your resume to people.
Awesome. And George has posted in the chat for everybody some more information about informational interviews overall, and the LinkedIn page that corresponds to UVA alumni and LinkedIn. So check that out if you haven't already. Hugely helpful resource. So pivoting back over to these questions, a different vein. So, what are some of the challenges, Sydney, that you encounter in the environmental consulting space? And have you ever had to work on a project that was challenging or that you didn't agree with?
Yeah, I would say every project that I work on is challenging for different reasons. In my specific field, one of the biggest challenges we have, so I consult for the Air Force, which is a huge organization with a huge hierarchy and chain of command. And operating within that chain of command is a constant challenge because we might operate with an action officer and make decisions, but we need to make sure that those decisions are approved by the correct people at the right level. So they might have to run that discussion up the chain of command before we can move out on something. Also, just dealing with organizational red tape of starting on a project and then just hitting a wall for whatever reason. Maybe someone at leadership just decides they don't want to do it anymore, or they run out of funding, etc. So those kinds of challenges of just working with another organization. Also, if that organization is disorganized, maybe they don't have the information that you need in order to do the analysis to give them a recommendation, that is sometimes a challenge. I know that that's not specific to my job. Like, I've got a really good friend who does financial kind of consulting, and it's the same challenge of like, they just have a difficult time getting the information out of the clients to analyze it and to do your job. What are some other challenges that I deal with? Yeah, I'd say that's probably the biggest. There's also always like personnel challenges that might happen. I'm lucky that I work on a really great team, but sometimes there's interpersonal dynamic issues with, it's mostly with customers that we deal with, that can make it challenging. Yeah.
That's super helpful. And before the call, we were talking a little bit about the types of projects sometimes that students get to work on. Could you speak to that sort of, I know sometimes they're curious, you know, how much freedom do I have in a consultant role to sort of choose what projects I'm on, or those types of things? Could you speak to that, maybe in terms of that, in terms of agreement or challenges that might happen there?
Yeah. So again, it's going to depend. You know, if you're working for a huge corporation, well, I can't speak to this because I haven't worked for a giant corporation, but sometimes you just get like staffed on projects where you don't really have say. They just like need you on that project. But also with big corporations, there's probably a more diverse range of projects. And so depending on the corporation, you might be able to express interest in a certain type of project, and they might be more willing to like staff you on those. For me, as a small company, I pretty much get to work on most projects that come through. One thing to think about in like the environmental world is there's so much, and most of the time people get into this field because they want to help make the environment better and cleaner, and that's really where a lot of the work is going towards. But you know, there could be instances, depending on the company or what, where it could be like the opposite. An example is like environmental law. Most people go into that because they want to defend the environment, but you know, big fossil fuel companies need environmental lawyers to defend their poor decisions. So that is, you know, it could be something to worth considering. Did that answer your question?
It did. That's helpful.
I feel like I'm just
no, it's helpful. No, I think it's good perspective to think about in terms of, you know, one, the difference between larger organizations and smaller organizations, and two, which level of freedom and variety of topics of products that students can work on. So hugely helpful context for students, especially for those of us who are just still learning about the field overall. So thank you so much.
Yeah. What I'll also add is, because my company is small, even before I switched positions, I would sometimes work on projects that weren't related to the environment at all. Still kind of same concept of developing software for the Air Force, but they, you know, just needed my help on something. So I'd work on something that, you know, has to deal with AC units on Air Force bases or something. And you kind of just have to be okay with that, knowing like maybe your job's not 100% environmental, but still making an impact.
Totally. That's awesome. So you seem to speak very fondly of your time at UVA, which I love. Could you speak at all to any of the skills maybe you developed at UVA that really served you well in your work as a consultant?
Yeah, I think this kind of relates to what we talked about earlier. At UVA, like I was involved in a lot of clubs where we did flyering on the lawn and tabling, and that kind of interpersonal, like just relationship building and being comfortable talking to people has been really helpful. Skills I talked about, Excel, and writing, other skills. The liberal arts background definitely was really helpful. While like I don't necessarily do something now that is, for environmental science, I had to take atmosphere and weather. Like I don't, do anything that deals with clouds or having to know the science behind it. But learning to just think critically in like that approach has been helpful. Yeah, I don't know if anything else to add to that.
No, that's good. I think the critical thinking piece is something we hear pretty often, and critical thinking is one of those buzzwords that's used a lot of, like, critical thinking, liberal arts, but the ability to really think about things, from different perspectives and holistically is a really helpful skill set and spans industries. So I love that you had that experience, and many students on the call have also had that too. So that's really helpful. And I got some really good questions from students in the chat. So I'm just going to breeze through these last ones and get to their questions, but they're better than mine. But in speaking of that transition from UVA to the working world, what did you find most challenging about making that transition?
The schedule difference. At UVA, you might be able to sleep in until 10 o'clock and then go to your 11 o'clock class. And you might be up until 2 a.m. studying, but you might have a 3-hour break in the afternoon where you can go lay out on the lawn. Switching to a 9 to 5 schedule was exhausting. I was just constantly exhausted for weeks until I got used to it. And realizing like I miss most of the sunshine every day. And so that was definitely hard. And just the physical aspect of I sit in front of a computer all day long. I'm no longer like walking between classes or walking to the dining hall. And so I have found little things of course it was all blown up with COVID, but now that I'm working from home, but still trying to find these things to do that help make the daily schedule a little more bearable, like taking a lunch break, not eating at my desk. Today I ate at my desk and I regretted it. Or, going for a walk at lunchtime to feel some sunshine. I try to wake up early, take time before work rather than just roll out of bed and go straight to work. But yeah, the schedule definitely. But on the bright side, what is really nice is, at school, there's always something like you always have more homework to do. There's always a chapter to be read or a paper to write. Whereas, at least in my job, when I finish the day at 5 o'clock, I'm done. I don't go home. I don't do work at home. On the weekends, like I have my weekends free. I don't feel guilty that I'm not studying for my test on Sunday. So that is kind of nice to be able to clearly define like work and personal life.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned, Sydney, the COVID style. I'm going to pause though, because George has a better question than me. So go ahead, George.
Honestly, it's not a better question. It's just, you talk about that transition, but how long did it take for that transition to actually happen? Obviously when you graduate, it's not like a one and done thing of like, all right, 9 to 5, like I'm ready to go. I think for students to hear that it is a transition, but how long did that take? Also,
it probably took me a couple weeks to like, I don't know, less than a year, but longer than you would expect for me to really like get in the groove and feel comfortable with it. Yeah. Now I'm used to it. After
Yeah.
3 years.
And now you can't sleep in anymore, right? That's the worst part. It's so hard. Well, you were talking a little bit about, how your life has transitioned work-wise with COVID. I was just curious to speak a little bit about how that transition has been, how you've coped with that, and going from maybe the routine is completely different, because students have had a very similar disruption. Just curious about some of your coping strategies and how your work routine especially changed.
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously I'm working remotely. I am very, very fortunate that my company's work was not impacted by it. So, we didn't lay off anyone. And half of my company works remote full-time anyways. So we were able to pretty seamlessly transition to a full-time remote situation. And working for the government, really, or the military in particular, that will always be funded. So even during times of recessions, like my job is really stable, which is, I am very thankful for that. In terms of, so I'm working from home. I had to buy a table, having a second screen at home, like shifting around my furniture in my tiny 1-bedroom apartment. What I actually did, because I'm a type A organized person, I wrote recently, actually, I was like, I need to get a schedule better. Like, this is driving me insane. I physically wrote out like what I wanted my daily schedule to be. So I wanted to wake up at 6:30 and I wanted to do a workout and then shower so I can start work at 8:30. And then like the days I was like, I want to go for walks at 5 o'clock to transition from work mind to personal mind. And actually writing out that schedule has helped. And being able to I can now check it off and say, I woke up at 6:30 today, good. I would really recommend that to anyone who's kind of struggling with this, floating, not really sure what's going on. With the daily schedule. Yeah.
I'm actually going to dig Sydney into some of these student questions. There are a couple in private chat and a couple that are out in public. So I want to try to address those principally. So the first one that came in, are there case interviews in sustainability consulting interviews, / are there internships in this space? And what does recruiting look like? It's a lot of different questions in one, but just curious about internships, recruiting timeline, and then also just case interviews in sustainability.
Mm-hmm. So there's tons of internships. As with every field, some are going to be paid and some are not going to be paid. I did an internship for Wild Virginia, which is based in Charlottesville. It's a small nonprofit. It was non-paid, but I really felt like I was making a difference because it's a small nonprofit and I just got good experience. If you can afford a non-paid internship, reaching out to nonprofits is a great opportunity because they are always looking for people. And they might even be able to just make an internship for you if they don't already have a position. The bigger companies will more likely have a paid internship or more defined roles. I'd say you could find those the same way that you would find a job, reaching out to people or companies just looking to see if they have internships. I would strongly recommend getting an internship over the summer when possible. It is nice to have that on your resume when you go to apply for a real job, and sometimes it can turn into a full-time position after that.
Totally. Well, Sydney, I know this summer, obviously, many students had disrupted plans with internships and formal experiences. Do you have any advice or insight on things that they could be doing until classes get started to sort of gain some experience if an internship wasn't in the cards or they weren't able to find something that was remote based? Yeah,
that's a great question. I will also say every student right now is in the same boat. So people are always I'm going to fall behind, but you're not falling behind anyone because literally everyone is in the same boat as you. Employers are going to know that if you go to apply and you don't have an internship for the summer, just be like, COVID, they'll be like, oh, okay. So don't stress too much about it. In terms of what could you be doing right now? That's a great question. I would say, see if there's just some organization that you can get involved in and volunteer at. Like here in Atlanta, we've got the Chattahoochee River. They've got like river cleanups, just going to those, volunteering in the community, just doing something. I know like some of those things aren't as prominent or available anymore because of social distancing. But that's, you know, still something you could put on your resume of like, I've experienced picking up trash along a river, you know. Yeah.
It was a curveball question too. And students, you know, we've got access to LinkedIn Learning and Coursera, both of which have got great resources to educate yourself on different areas, whether it be in environmental science, sustainability, consulting, et cetera. So definitely take advantage of that and look at those different areas. I might have George or Kyle put the link in the chat for you all, just in case you haven't seen it already. That could be helpful. And Sydney also mentioned informational interviews being super helpful to do to learn. This is a great time to maximize your not having a full class schedule to balance and get some education in before classes get started too. So yeah. Awesome, cool. Let me make sure I don't miss any of these questions because they're so good. So Bridget asked, you know, should a sustainability consultant definitely have a major in environmental science / sustainability?
That's a great question. If you are looking to go into sustainability consulting, I would recommend something related to sustainability. Doesn't necessarily have to be a major, you know, their UVA has a global sustainability minor, or they did at least 3 years ago. That would be helpful. Courses in sustainability that you can say you took, internships, yeah, something could be helpful, more than nothing. Like if we were hiring someone right now for an environmental management system consultant like I was, and they had nothing environmental on their resume, we probably wouldn't give them like an interview, unless they had really awesome experience with other things and they wrote an awesome cover letter about everything else they did that's like sustainability related.
Looks like George just posted, if you're not in those majors, some great ways getting involved on grounds at UVA. So yes. It's a niche area, right? So getting something in that area would be helpful versus completely out of bounds, just coming into it without any experience at all. It makes a ton of sense. I've got a question that may or may not be too specific, Sydney, so we can pass it if we need to. But you mentioned a little bit about Excel and sort of the skill set in that. So I've heard consultants mention Excel as part of their day-to-day experiences. I want to play up the fact that I have Excel skills on my resume. Curious if there's like a more specific way to frame one's Excel experience, like either on a resume or in an interview. Like what does Excel look like on the job? For example, is it knowing pivot tables? Is it knowing VBA? How might they talk about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll say too, it's one of those things that, at least in my field, we don't ask about it specifically in interviews, but it is very useful. You know, the way that I use it, I don't really use pivot tables that often. There have been a couple times when I have, so it has been useful to know how to do pivot tables. But like the formulas and how to do complex formulas to really build like a model, say, okay, if I put data in here, it's going to change all of these other cells, to kind of help calculate things. Also just general, like organizing it, how to play it up on the resume. That is a great question. You know, because everyone puts, oh, proficient in Excel, but it's like, are you really proficient in Excel, or do you just know how to enter numbers into the cells, but do you know how to use the formulas and everything? One thing that I've seen is putting in like your prior experience when you've used Excel before, to say like analyzed data using pivot tables in Excel, like as a bullet point in like your internship description, for example. that, and the more specific you can be of like, you know, analyze 100,000 lines of data, that is going to help recruiters see, oh, this person actually like knows how to use Excel because they've done it before and they've done these like more complex functions in it.
Totally, like finding a specific example of time you used Excel, putting that on your resume, and in an interview too. I think if they ask about times that you use complex data, pull in a great Excel example for that. So that was a great point. Awesome. All right, so I think that hits all the student questions that I had in there. I'm curious, Sydney, just sort of for learning purposes, are there any resources that you use to stay current on like newsletters or blogs or associations that would be helpful for students to be following or learning more about?
I'm embarrassed to say that I don't. I should. You know, I get UVA sustainability newsletter emails, and sometimes I read those, which I find interesting. But in terms of like staying current in my field, it's a very niche field that I'm in. So there aren't really specific newsletters or blogs that I would point to. But, you know, there's a ton out there, especially while you're looking for jobs or trying to figure out what even jobs are out there. Those would be really great places to look at. I wish I had like a recommendation.
No, I think it humanizes it a little bit, you know, that people don't have to be up at 5 a.m. reading all these blogs and newsletters until they start their classes and then again before they go to bed. So I think it's helpful to know that too. And it sounds like for knowledge bases, you mentioned faculty as great partners, sustainability at UVA on grounds as great partners, and alumni as always is sort of gaining understanding and more learning from that too. Students, I want you to keep asking questions, so feel free to keep popping in the chat. George, any other questions that you wanted to ask on the sustainability vein of Sydney tonight? Because I'm out, so anybody who has more questions, feel free to pop them in.
Nothing that comes to mind. This is all great information. I learned a ton of stuff. So this, thank you, Sydney. This has been super helpful for me personally to be able to help students. So again, thank you.
And I think one thing that Sydney mentioned students that I think would be helpful, she talked about for informational interviews being organized. So in developing these questions, I was pretty strategic with George of kind of what I was curious about. So think about what you're curious about when you're talking to an alum and ask questions that are really specific to that because they're going to be looking to you to drive that conversation. So think about what's important to you. I know Sydney mentioned culture when she was talking about her interview and how that was an important factor for her, and her interview gave her a good sense of culture. So think about what type of culture you're looking for. I guess, Sydney, I'm just going to ask a question about that and give students one last opportunity to put questions in. How did you know that was the culture that you were looking for? I think people are always like, culture is super important, but I think it's hard to sort of define. How did you know that it was going to be a good fit for you when you had that interview?
That's such a great question. Like, it's cheesy, but like, you just kind of know, like, feel it. Like, everyone was just super friendly. I got the impression that, like, everyone who I was talking to in the interviews, like, that they all got along with each other. And that in itself was really important to me. Like, I felt like they were kind of a little, like, still professional relationship, but more than just like, oh, this is the person who I sit next to all day long and work next to. Also, like, working for a small company, I got to meet, like, the founder of my company in the interview, and hearing him talk about the company and what he's built and what he wants it to be, and that he built the company because he didn't like the way that, like, big corporations were doing it. And so he was like, I just went off my own way and I wanted to do it differently. Like, that was really nice. Some of the, like, benefits that they had provided to us. So, you know, one thing that we get is every associate gets $100 a month to spend on social activities with other associates. So it's kind of like a, hey, you want to go out to lunch with coworkers? Here's money for it. You want to go to a festival in the city? You can do that and expense it. And so knowing that benefit existed was like, oh, like, that's going to foster, like, good relationships with coworkers. And I was looking for that. Especially moving to a city that I didn't know anyone, I was like, I hope I can make friends with my coworkers.
Awesome benefit. I love that. So Cindy, I have another question that I wanted to ask, because I think this is a big question mark for students. So interviewing is going to be all virtual for students this fall, and that's a big pressure point. Any advice for students on navigating virtual interviews, or maybe how to make an impression in something like that? Because I know that they're lacking that human element, feels challenging. Just any insight you have or thoughts you have about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually just did some video interviews last week. And I can tell you like what I thought made really good impressions. One, having a reliable internet connection. It's really difficult when you're going in and out. I know it like might not be your fault. So like there's some understanding, but it's a little frustrating from the interviewer standpoint. Having a solid background. So, don't position your camera where they can see your entire messy bedroom. Also, setting it up in a way that you're looking at the screen kind of close to where the camera is. We interviewed one person where the camera was like off to the side and she was looking somewhere else. So the whole time we're looking at the side of her face. It's fine. We can still talk to her, but it just wasn't as clean and professional looking. I would recommend if you haven't, you've probably all done Zoom like with your friends in this time period, but set it up beforehand and just kind of run a test, make sure everything's working. Always try to get in to the meeting a couple minutes early. This way, if there are technical issues, you can figure that out. Wear pants, like fully dress for it. You've probably all seen the horror stories. Be prepared for that.
That's good advice. And students, one little insight about the internet connection we hear is that maybe sometimes getting an Ethernet cord and plugging in directly to your computer sometimes can stabilize that connection, as well as if you're in a shared household internet, asking everybody else to be off the internet at that time and disconnecting your device from all other applications can be helpful to make your internet connection more reliable. So more content will be posted to our website soon on with all those tips for you, because we know that that's going to be a little bit different than traditional format. There is one question I want to get to, I think it's probably the last one. Is there typically a timeline for consulting firms with sustainability? You mentioned that for the smaller firms, it's not like as needed, so less formalized, but any insight on just timeline overall for sustainability consulting?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's going to depend on the firm. Like I said, you just mentioned, we don't have a specific timeline. It's just when we need someone. A lot of companies who are recruiting out of school, they know that you're probably going to graduate in May. And so they'll start recruiting like a couple months before, maybe like starting January, February through that year, to try to lock you down. I think I had accepted my job offer in like the March timeframe. And they really wanted me to start right away, but I couldn't because I had to graduate. So we delayed it a bit. There's not, I wouldn't say there's a timeline specific to sustainability consulting. It kind of just meshes with recruitment in general. Companies, recruiters do also know that sometimes people graduate in December. So there might be a smaller recruiting effort to target the December graduates.
Totally. And if those bigger firm students, really it starts off in August and really gets going from then until September and finishes up in October, usually, the larger firms. So it is very specific for the bigger ones, but there is some variability across just different types of consulting firm spaces that can be more niche, like Sydney was talking about too. So it's a great question. Well, Sydney, thank you so much for your knowledge, for your help, for your time. This was hugely helpful, and students, thank you for being here. Really appreciate